Hello everyone. In this presentation, I'll be providing historical and thematic context for the early to mid 20th century and the literary theory, modernism. For this presentation, I will focus on the American English writer T.S. Eliot and my absolute favorite writer, Virginia Woolf. So, let's get started. As with previous centuries, the early to mid 20th century's literary traditions were a reaction to the previous eras. Industrialization continued to transform the cultural and literary landscape at an alarming rate. Because of the rapid pace of social and technological change, modernity disrupted the old order, upended ethical and social codes, cast into doubt previously stable assumptions about self, community, the world, and the divine. To state that a lot happened in the early 20th century is a massive understatement. For the British monarchy, the first half of the 20th century witnessed rapid changes, which was probably especially shocking after the long reign of Queen Victoria. After Queen Victoria's death in 1901, King Edward VII reigned from 1901 to 1910. His short reign ended with his death. King George V followed from 1911 to 1936, and King Edward VIII reigned in 1936. However, he abdicated the throne to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson. His brother, King George VI, took over the throne and reigned from 1937 to 1952. The United Kingdom was hit especially hard during the two world wars that took place from 1914 to 1918 and 1939 to 1945. Virginia Woolf's own home in London was bombed during the German air raids at least twice during World War II, forcing her and her husband to evacuate London. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1920, and its harsh treatment of Germany was largely believed to have led to the economic depression that eventually allowed Hitler to come to power in 1933. World War II ended when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in 1945. Although the European side of the war had ended by then, the human devastation experienced as the world learned of two cities destroyed in a matter of seconds ushered in a terrifying vision of how much destruction human ingenuity can exert upon the world. However, there is at least one bright spot during this time period. Women 30 and over gained the right to vote in England in 1918. Modernism is a philosophical and artistic ideology that was popularized in the early half of the 20th century. Modernists rejected the conventional. In other words, they rejected boring and restricting traditions because they limit both creative potential and human individuality. In art, modernism championed the phrase art for art's sake, which is a reference to the belief that art should only reflect itself. That is, it should not try to be something else. In literature, for instance, this meant that writers should not try to recreate or simulate reality, because that's not what language is meant for. Instead, writers should rely more on symbolism and allegory to convey their ideas. Some key characteristics of modernist literature include fragmented narratives, such as multiple narratives and nonlinear time, internal psychological focus, the individual's alienation from society and its traditions and expectations, reliance on symbolism and allegory over realism, and classics and or myths invoked and transformed into something new. If there's any writer that I wish I could emulate in my own writing, it's Virginia Woolf. Her particular style of writing is so unique that I doubt anyone would be able to copy it without sounding derivative. Virginia Woolf lived from 1882 to 1941. She lived during a time when women were not allowed or afforded the same formal educational opportunities as men. Women's colleges did exist, however, they did not offer the same rigorous courses, nor did the degrees that women earned at those colleges help them to gain employment. In fact, employers were reluctant to hire women with a formal education because that means they'd have to pay them more. Thanks in large part to her father's library, Woolf and her sister were able to teach themselves. For most of her life, Woolf suffered from severe mental illnesses that ultimately took her life when she died by suicide, stating in her devastating final letter to her husband, "I feel certain I am going mad again. I feel we can't go through another of those terrible times, and I shan't recover. this time. She and her husband, Leonard Woolf, started Hogarth Press, which published many of Woolf's novels, as well as other modernists and an English translation of Freud's works. Next, I'd like to discuss some key characteristics of Woolf's writing. First, Woolf relied heavily on a stream of consciousness style of writing. That is, her writing had the appearance of somebody who is unraveling their thoughts as they come without any kind of editing. However spontaneous this style may appear, Woolf was a perfectionist. Every word, every sentence was heavily edited and considered. To appear so spontaneous and artless took an enormous amount of effort. Woolf also found heroism and beauty in the mundane, everyday life of her characters. Something as minor as going out to buy some flowers could be transformed into an intense psychological study. When reading The Lady in the Looking Glass, for instance, we see an example of what Anne Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter, labeled as psychological projection. This is a defense mechanism where a person will project their own fears and insecurities onto an external object or person. Students often become confused when reading the story because they're used to trusting the narrator's perception. But remember, the story is not told from Isabella's perspective, and so what we are really seeing is the narrator's reflection. Woolf finds inspiration in the mind and its relationship with its own body and the world outside it. In an essay that I strongly suggest students read for its relevance today, On Being Ill, Woolf writes, "The merest schoolgirl, when she falls in love, has Shakespeare or Keats to speak her mind for her. But let a sufferer try to describe a pain in his head to a doctor, and language at once runs dry." One of Woolf's desires in writing was to create a language of illness, to illustrate the inexplicable. After all, when it comes to pain, whether physical or psychological, we continue to struggle to communicate what it feels like. Born in 1888, T.S. Eliot is a writer who crosses the Atlantic divide between the United States and England. He was educated at Harvard, but he settled in London and became a British subject in 1927. There, he was to remain for the rest of his life. During that time, Eliot became an influential poet and literary critic. His essays analyzing literature like Shakespeare inspired unique lines of thought, not to mention controversy. For instance, he found Titus Andronicus, one of Shakespeare's first tragedies, too ugly to be included in Shakespeare's canon. According to Eliot, the poet must become more and more comprehensive, more elusive, more indirect, in order to force, to dislocate if necessary, language into its meaning. In other words, Eliot believes that poetry must rely on the unique features of language to create meaning. This required the heavy use of writing techniques like metaphor and allusions. For Eliot, the reader must be an active agent in creating meaning, mostly through diving in to the relationships between words and images. Some key characteristics of Eliot's style include a feeling that English poetry had been exhausted of vitality. Eliot believed that the poetic medium itself is more important than the writer's personality, and he found symbols to be simultaneously more precise and endlessly suggestive in their meanings because of their relationship to other images. In other words, symbols could be simultaneously precise in conveying the text's ideas, but they could also suggest more ideas than the writer may have intended. These ideas stem from the study of signs and symbols and their use or interpretation, otherwise known as semiotics. In semiotics, the symbol, sign, or signifier has an arbitrary relationship to the thing it is meant to represent. For instance, the word tree is only a sign, a placeholder for the actual thing itself. The word could be anything. In fact, in other languages, it is. The Spanish word for tree is el árbol, which looks nothing like the English word, though they both roughly mean the same thing. Likewise, in both languages, speakers will have different associations with their respective words for trees, and therefore different potential meanings. Most importantly, Eliot's real novelty was his deliberate elimination of all merely connective and transitional passages, his building up of the total pattern of meaning through the immediate juxtaposition of images without overt explanation of what they are doing. Ancient and modern voices, high and low art, Western and non-Western languages clash, coincide, jostle alongside one another. The intention is for the reader to generate meaning in the space between the words and images the writer presents. Therefore, it is important for the reader to look at two images and determine why they were placed together. Thank you for watching, and please let me know if you have any questions.